How many of you out there would classify yourself as deadhead? How many of you have heard of the Grateful Dead? Outstanding. How many of you can name 100 Grateful Dead songs? I was hoping one of you could. Anyway, today what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the birth of the Grateful Dead. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the innovations of the Grateful Dead, and I'm going to start by talking to you about the birth of the Dead. In 1962, a group of musicians formed to play in a jug band. In 1964, they formed Mother McGree's Uptown Jug Band, playing pretty simplistic music in a way that would probably not catch anyone's attention. In 1995, on the band's 50th anniversary, 20 years after the death of Jerry Garcia, the leader of the band, they played 5 sold-out shows that grossed $50 million, have over $100 million in pay-per-view, and the money is still coming in pay-per-view, so there's not any kind of sense yet of what's going to happen. Set single-day attendance records at Soldier Field, way outdrew Taylor Swift and the Rolling Stones, the other 2 large bands of this year. And so the question is, how did this group of musicians who in 1964 seemed to have nothing going on become the superstar band of 2015, 20 years after they stopped touring? What I think is important is to think about, what did they do that was different? What lessons can we take from a band that evolved over its career and worked 20 years to make things something that's completely and absolutely different? To understand that, first we have to understand the history of the band and what they did. So the first thing to know is that the band brought together 5 pretty diverse musicians. Jerry Garcia, whose background was in bluegrass. Phil Lesh, who was a conservatory student at Mills College, who was a contemporary avant-garde composer. Big Pen McKernan, whose father was a blues DJ and was steeped in the blues. Bill Kreutzmann, a straight-ahead rock and roll drummer. And Bob Weir, who was just kind of a kid who showed up one day to get a music lesson on New Year's Eve. So what is it that makes this so unique? It's that fusion of music styles. It's the absolute lack of fear to be classified, to be put into a category, and to experiment. So that's the first lesson. The second thing that happened for the Grateful Dead is that they drew what was known as the Legion of Deadheads. In other words, what they did was they invited people to be part of their family. They did this through a number of practices. They did innumerable free concerts that were part of the San Francisco scene, and they were birthed in the acid tests. And for those of you who haven't heard of the Merry Pranksters, one of the things that the pranksters did is they were trying to do these social and political experiments, including the use of acid, to see what would happen when you got a whole bunch of people in a room and dosed them. But in order to make that work, they decided they needed a musical act to be part of that, and that musical act was the Grateful Dead. Ken Kesey, the most famous of the Merry Pranksters, once said, "The Grateful Dead was the engine that drove the tests." It was this moment, that sense of absolute freedom, that you could do whatever you want, whenever you wanted to do it, that really gave the Grateful Dead their avant-garde and experimental style. And it was a way that those styles could really work in order to see that you could change things up even in midstream, much like I'm finding myself doing right now. I think that the third thing that's really important about the Dead is that they really invested in the artists that were around them. They found a group of poster artists, Wes Welston, Stanley Mouse, Alton Kelly, who were all incredibly talented and were willing to work together with the band to create a unique visual iconography. This iconography, even if you're not a fan of the Grateful Dead, is something that probably stands out and created more than just a brand, but a calling card, a way for people to find the band. And if you even look around in Billings, including my car, of course, you'll see skulls and roses and terrapins and dancing bears. That kind of identification, that bringing people together, is one of the things that make them a unique and innovative band. The birth of the Dead, the combination of styles as well as the communal nature of where they grew up and how they got together, is what led to a number of innovations in the band's history. The first innovation, and the one that I think is the most amazing, was that they were live. They were a live band. In fact, in their career of 30 years, they only recorded 13 studio albums. For most bands of that time, that would be absolute suicide, because bands made money by selling albums. The Grateful Dead made their money by being on an endless tour. Over the 30 years that they were part of the musical scene, they played over 2,300 concerts. And for those of you who are in the know, a Grateful Dead concert was never the same night to night. In fact, they'd play a 5-night stand and not repeat a single song. What does that mean? It means you have to be really good and have a really, really deep repertoire so that people never knew what to expect. It's the juxtaposition of the familiar and the unexpected, that idea that you're both going to be comforted and surprised, that created the legion of people who are willing to spend a whole week, let alone a whole summer, or maybe 30 years, following your band around. That live impulse required them to rethink what it meant to have the technology of a concert. So, in 1964, when the band was just beginning, you might remember that the big acts that year were the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. They were the rock and roll icons, and nobody ever heard a thing that they sang because everybody was just screaming in the background. That wouldn't work for the Grateful Dead. For one thing, their original concert in a pizza parlor maybe had 15 people there, mainly family members, of course. So they started to think about, how do we make the technology of a live concert sound as good as a small jazz club? As they started to move from pizza parlors to theaters with a couple of hundred, to arenas of a few thousand, and finally to stadiums of 70,000, they wanted to make sure that they didn't lose the clarity and the fidelity of the small sound that they had at the acid tests. And so Owsley Stanley, who was a brilliant man but not a fabulous engineer, started to think about, what is it that I can do to recreate the warmth and the cohesiveness of a small sound? And so one of the things that the Grateful Dead was always doing was thinking about, how is it that I'm going to make things sound as strong as I possibly can? Up there you would see the Wall of Sound, which was a collection of speakers, and the idea was that you could put the speakers together in a way that every speaker had a unique feed to it, and it created this beautiful crystal sound. Unfortunately, it took 7 semi-trucks to carry, so it really didn't work, which is a lesson I'll talk about later. A second innovation was that the Grateful Dead actually called to their fans. In 1971, on an album called Skull and Roses, there was actually an insert that was put in that said, "Who are you? Where are you? Let us know, and we will keep in touch with you." This was the genesis of a fan club that was started by a band itself and not by an external player. So lots of bands had fan clubs, but this is the first time that a band had actually invited fans to keep in contact. The band used this as a way to make sure that the fans were always engaged and knew what the tour schedule was, knew what albums were coming out, and it was embraced warmly. As a result, in 2015, there's still a newsletter that is being distributed by Grateful Dead Productions 20 years after the band has ceased to exist. The third innovation that the Grateful Dead had was that they decided that having people tape their music was actually a really good thing. So think about what it was like in 1970 for the music industry. The way that musicians made their money was by selling albums. And they sold those albums for very minuscule profit, but profit nonetheless. The music was owned by the industry, and the songwriters and the performers only received a very, very small portion of that money. Album sales were king, And it was incredible to think that you would give music away, that you would let people come in and make their own copies and allow those to be circulated. The Grateful Dead realized really quickly that what that did was that created a bond of trust and a relationship between the fans and the band. And they actually, in 1984, when they established their official taping policy, they told fans, once we're done with it, it's yours, as long as you don't profit from it. Grateful Dead's record sales and releases have always had a very high amount of success. They've done really, really well, and in part, it seems counterintuitive. If I can get the music for free, why would I ever buy something that's going to cost me 20 or 30 bucks? But the fans respected the band and were willing to respect the intellectual property, and that has actually presaged what's happened in the 21st century music industry. The fourth innovation, and I think one that's most important, is that they created a community that followed them. They were part of the circus that was the Grateful Dead, and that they allowed the fans to be part of that as well. So they were very connected. Bill Kreutzmann said in his book, Deal, we knew we were onto something when we saw that the same faces were in the crowd from San Francisco to New York City. It's a very powerful statement. So you're probably thinking, so what can I learn from this? How do the Grateful Dead's innovations teach me about how to be a better business person or be successful at whatever I do? I think that there are 5 lessons that the Grateful Dead can teach us. The first and most important is always be yourself. You should trust who you are, and you shouldn't worry about it. You should do what you need to do to be successful. So don't try to find that pigeonhole. Don't look for that moment to be like someone else, because if the Grateful Dead had tried to be a jug band, I doubt that I'd be talking about them right now. The second lesson is search for perfection, but don't stop if you can't achieve it. The Grateful Dead never played a song twice the same way. They never played a set twice the same day. And they were always willing to take risks. They were always willing to try something different. But they always wanted to be the best that they could be as they were making that effort. That's a really phenomenal thing to think about, because many of us are paralyzed by the idea that if we can't get it exactly right, if it's not just exactly perfect, it's not worth doing. Here's a band that oftentimes was worse than not exactly perfect, and yet we can still see them as incredible innovators and influential people in the music and cultural world. The third lesson is keep your mission central. Amongst all the merchandising, the posters, the traveling circus, it was always about the music. If the Grateful Dead weren't good musicians, if they weren't doing things that helped their audience connect, then it would be doubtful that they'd be able to sustain the rest that was going all around. If you look back into the 90s, you can look back at examples of pop bands that didn't make it about the music. It was all about the dance or all about the show. And those folks don't have a memory unless you happen to be a very specific fan. The fourth lesson is relationships are the key. If you can maintain a relationship, if you can keep communication clear, then you can be sure that you're going to have a very strong relationship or following. So what you really need to do is remember that outreach, not being afraid to talk to people or to ask people or to let them know what's going on will really help folks to understand who you are. And I think that continuous communication from the Grateful Dead is what kept the Deadheads coming back. The fifth lesson, and the one that I think is the most very important about the Grateful Dead, is that it is important more than anything else to be sure that you are authentic. So if you aren't who you say you are, whether you're a performer, a speaker, or a person, it's really easy for folks to just cut you off, to just say, there's really nothing else here. And so that doesn't create those long-lasting relationships in business or in life. So after 15 minutes, you know quite a bit about the Grateful Dead, and I hope that you can take a lot of this and think about next time you listen to Trucking or Touch of Grey or Uncle John's Band, more than just the music, but the absolute change in the way that music happened and how that innovation has created a new way of thinking about what it means to perform and what it means to be part of an audience. Thank you.